McBarge has spent almost 4 decades with no real purpose, no customers, and no permanent home, but people have never stopped talking about it. The former floating McDonald's was built for Vancouver's Expo '86 and became one of the fair's most memorable attractions. But after the Expo ended, it became famous for a completely different reason. It turned into this strange, abandoned floating restaurant that nobody seemed to know what to do with. Today, it is partly sunk in the Fraser River. But what we have learned since it sank actually changes the story quite a bit. There is an owner on paper. There is a company connected to it that most people have probably never heard of. And there was even a real location chosen for its future, with land and a development plan, before everything quietly fell apart. This is the 2026 update on McBarge. And this story is not only about an old landmark that was lost. It is also about how McBarge spent most of its life stuck between different rules and jurisdictions. One of the strangest things about McBarge is that it basically has two identities. To most people, it was Friendship 500, the floating McDonald's, and only the second floating McDonald's ever built after the one in St. Louis. It was created to celebrate McDonald's 500th Canadian location, and to show off the idea of a restaurant that could theoretically be moved anywhere with a dock and power connection. But legally, it is not really a restaurant. On paper, it is a 57-meter vessel called Seabourn 2, and those two identities have followed it for its entire life. It has always been partly a building and partly a boat, without ever fitting perfectly into either category. Think about a normal building. It has an address, a piece of land, property taxes, inspections, and possibly heritage protection. Banks can lend money against it because the building and the land underneath it have clear legal value. A ship works differently. It has a registration, inspections, insurance, and people responsible for checking its condition. McBarge was stuck somewhere between those two systems. It was too much like a building to function like a normal ship, but too much like a ship to be treated like a normal building. And once you understand that, a lot of what happened afterward makes much more sense. The problem started almost immediately after Expo '86 ended in October 1986. The restaurant had been extremely popular during the Expo, but once the event was over, it closed and remained sitting in False Creek. Vancouver would not allow it to reopen there, and because McBarge did not actually own the water underneath it, the city could simply refuse to let it stay and operate. At the same time, McDonald's was reportedly spending around $150,000 every year just maintaining and securing something that was making no money, and unlike normal real estate, there was no land underneath it increasing in value. Eventually, the gangways were removed, and McBarge was towed away to an anchorage in Burrard Inlet. Most people remember that period as the moment McBarge was abandoned, but in some ways, that anchorage may have been the safest place it ever had. It was sitting in federal waters, outside the normal control of a city. There was no local bylaw officer who could simply order it removed, and that is part of the reason it managed to survive there for close to 2 decades, while the old Expo lands around False Creek were completely redeveloped. What looked like simple neglect was also the result of McBarge sitting in a strange legal position where nobody had a strong reason or clear authority to deal with it. When Howard Meakin bought McBarge in 1999, he was not simply buying an old restaurant. He was buying a huge floating structure without a permanent legal home. Over the years, different ideas were suggested for it, including reopening it as a restaurant, turning it into a landmark, or using it as a museum. But every plan had the same basic problem. McBarge needed somewhere permanent to go. It needed actual land, a municipality willing to approve the project, and a development plan that could legally move forward. Meakin spent more than 2 decades trying to make that happen. Then, in December 2015, McBarge was moved down the Fraser River and tied up at a workyard in Maple Ridge under a moorage agreement with a local family business. Around that time, most of the original McDonald's interior was removed. The kitchens, restaurant equipment, fittings, and other parts were stripped out until the structure was basically an empty shell. At that point, even its connection to being an actual restaurant became much weaker. It was now mostly just an old hull with windows and the remains of its original design. There was also an effort to have McBarge recognized as historically important. That effort is sometimes described as simply a petition that failed to get enough support. But the bigger problem was more complicated. Heritage protection normally applies to a specific property or location. There is usually an address, a lot, or a defined piece of land connected to the historic structure. McBarge did not have any of that. It kept moving and had no permanent site. So even the system that might have protected it struggled to deal with something that technically did not have a permanent location. We now know that the proposed location was in Mission, farther up the Fraser River. The plan involved using McBarge as a floating restaurant connected to a waterfront development, but that plan eventually collapsed because the municipality itself bought the riverfront property that Meakin needed. So after years of trying to find land for McBarge, the exact property connected to one of its most serious plans ended up being purchased by the local government. After that, the situation became much worse. Phil Knighton died in 2023, and no major new plan was announced. More recently, the man whose family owned the moorage revealed something even more concerning. According to him, McBarge had basically been in a state of perpetual sinking for around 20 years. Workers would pump water out of it and the barge would rise again. If the pumping stopped, it would slowly begin sinking. There had been rumors for years that people were occasionally pumping it out or adding air to keep it floating. Those rumors were apparently true. McBarge was surviving because people were manually keeping it above water. And there was no regular system forcing someone to check its condition. A working ship normally gets inspected because it operates, has insurance, and needs to remain safe. A building gets inspected because it exists at a permanent address and falls under local rules. McBarge did neither. So for years, the main thing keeping it from sinking was simply people continuing to pump it out. Canada did introduce a law in 2019, making it illegal to abandon vessels in Canadian waters. But McBarge still did not become a major enforcement priority. The Coast Guard reportedly inspected it in late 2023 and found that it did not contain fuel or other major pollutants. It was not considered an immediate environmental danger. So even though the law existed, McBarge was still able to remain where it was because officials did not see it as a serious enough risk. Then, overnight on March 26, 2025, McBarge finally sank onto its side. By the next morning, much of the old floating McDonald's was underwater and resting in the mud. Just 15 days later, Howard Meakin passed away. After the sinking, the same old jurisdiction problem appeared again. Maple Ridge said the barge was in federal waters and therefore outside the city's responsibility. Transport Canada said it was grounded, secured, and was not considered a pollution risk or a danger to navigation. Officials said it was being monitored. There were also public statements that authorities had been unable to contact the owner. But technically, McBarge is not ownerless. The barge is connected to a company called Sturgeon Developments, so there is a name attached to it on paper. The bigger issue is that having a company name connected to an old, stripped, partly sunken barge does not automatically mean there is somebody willing or able to pay for its removal. By late 2025, that problem started affecting other people directly. A Maple Ridge businessman who builds prefabricated homes wanted to expand his operation onto the water and create a floating trades training facility, but McBarge was sitting in the exact area he wanted to use. He reportedly spent months trying to figure out who had authority over the wreck and who he needed to contact. He spoke with different levels of government, the Coast Guard, fisheries officials, and others, but still could not get a clear answer. The owner of the moorage described a similar experience, saying the family had spent years trying to resolve the problem without finding a clear solution. There are organizations willing to remove McBarge. One nonprofit that has already removed more than 100 abandoned boats from the coast of British Columbia has said it could handle the job. But the biggest problem is money. Somebody has to take responsibility for the barge before arranging and paying for the salvage, and removing something this large will not be cheap. Local river advocates have also warned that the longer McBarge sits there and sinks deeper into the mud, the more difficult and expensive removal could become. And that is probably the strangest part of the entire McBarge story. This thing survived for almost 40 years even though it only operated as a restaurant for one summer. Part of the reason it survived for so long was because it never fit cleanly into one legal category. But now that same problem is helping keep the wreck exactly where it is. Almost everyone agrees that it should eventually be removed, but nobody seems to have clear responsibility for doing it. If McBarge were leaking fuel or creating an immediate environmental danger, authorities would have much stronger reasons to act quickly. But because it is mostly sitting there without causing a major pollution problem, it has remained stuck in place. So the most likely ending for McBarge probably will not be a museum, a heritage restoration, or another floating restaurant. More likely, someone will eventually remove it because the space is needed for something else. And after 40 years of strange plans, failed developments, and legal confusion, that may end up being the surprisingly ordinary ending for one of the strangest buildings Vancouver ever put on the water.